Part 12. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 122. Shen Yu chuckled. She didn't expect that Li Jifeng had such a temperament, let alone that he could fall in love with Xieting Zhou. The carriage walked for a while and then stopped moving. Your Highness, Xifeng said outside. The government office is putting up notices and the people onlookers are blocking the road. Let's go around. Before Xieting Zhou could say anything, Li Jifeng raised his voice and said, a detour? Why should we take a detour? There is a prince, a heir apparent, and another in this carriage. Li Jifeng glanced at Shen Yu and said, forget it. Shen Yu. Xieting Zhou opened the curtain and took a look. There was an assassin in the palace. The curfew was just issued today, and the government posted another notice. The people blocked the road and watched. Let's take a detour. Xieting Zhou made a prompt decision. The carriage finally turned around, and the voices of people talking outside the carriage could be heard. So many domestic experts failed to catch the assassin and allowed him to escape from the palace. This shows that this assassin's kung fu is extraordinary. Yeah, but now that Shenjing has closed the city, he can't escape even if he doesn't. The reward is 100 taels of silver. Don't count on the reward. If you really see the assassin, your life will be gone. There will be no chance of getting any reward. Shen Yu looked at Xieting Zhou, assassin. Xieting Zhou looked at her calmly, the assassin has escaped. It seems that the grounding is not without its benefits. With just one glance, Shen Yu knew that Xieting Zhou was sure of his success. Shen Yu was silent for a moment, then suddenly opened the curtain and jumped out. A large group of people gathered around the place where the announcement was made, and the road was packed to the brim. Excuse me, I borrowed it, Shen Yu said while squeezing in. Suddenly a hand stretched out from her side to separate her from the others. When Shen Yu turned around, she saw Xieting Zhou's face. Xieting Zhou raised his chin and said, let's go and see it. Shen Yu nodded, and as Xieting Zhou squeezed to the front, she was stunned with just one glance. The person on the wanted poster portrait was the same portrait Xieting Zhou showed her, the old man Sanfu mentioned. The wanted order states that this person is extremely vicious and has killed several maids and eunuchs in the palace. Anyone with clues will be rewarded with 100 taels of silver. Both knew who the real assassin was. After exiting the crowd, Shen Yu lowered her voice and said, someone must have framed this person. Xieting Zhou nodded, they are looking for someone, but they don't dare to look for them in a big way. It just so happens that an assassin appears in the palace, and they can take this opportunity to turn Shenjing upside down. Then who is looking for him? Shen Yu looked up at Xieting Zhou. There are only 3 corpses among 4 people, which means he has successfully escaped and we are looking for him to kill and silence him. Shen Yu said, we have to find him before he is silenced. The other party is so nervous, so he must be a key figure. If he is really from Kikane, he might know something about grain and grass. Xieting Zhou looked solemn, now that I'm grounded, there are many constraints on many things. It doesn't matter, I can do it myself. Shen Yu thought for a while and said, I want to go find Sanfu and Sixi first, and then go back to the Shen family. Why are you going back to Shen's house? Xieting Zhou asked. Shen Yu looked around twice, and after confirming that there was no one around, she said, then I thought carefully about what I said to Emperor Su and Ji Liangji. It was the battle between the princes that led to the defeat of Yanliang Pass. My father was recruited by them. The defeat at Yanliangwan must be due to a conflict, either because they failed to win over each other, or my father has chosen to take sides, and I want to go back to his study to see if there are any clues. Xieting Zhou looked at her, be careful, there is a curfew starting today, and you must be back before midnight. Okay. Shen Yu looked at the carriage, the 9th prince is calling you, please come back. Just as she was about to leave, Xieting Zhou grabbed her wrist. Shen Yu was stunned for a moment. Don't let people worry about you, Xieting Zhou said. Shen Yu swallowed and felt Xieting Zhou squeeze her wrist. When he let go, she felt an emptiness in her heart for no reason. That. Xieting Zhou turned around. What's wrong? Shen Yu pursed her lips and said, I'll be back in the morning. Okay, Xieting Zhou smiled. This smile seemed to capture the beauty of spring in her eyes, and at the same time put the spring water into Shen Yu's heart, causing her to still feel her chest swaying on the way to find Sanfu. Sanfu was at the inn today, and when he saw Shen Yu, he hurriedly brought her in. Young master is finally here, Sanfu said anxiously. Young master, have you seen the wanted notice posted? Looked at it? Sanfu said, the Yaman asked anyone with news to report that he has been to our inn. If everyone goes there, wouldn't it be a problem if I don't go alone? You're not stupid. Shen Yu hooked her legs up on a chair and sat down. If someone reports to the government, someone will definitely come to the inn to interrogate the whole story. But you should know what should and shouldn't be said. Sanfu nodded repeatedly. Let's just say we met when we came to stay, but I won't tell you what happened that night, and I can't tell you what happened in the mass graves, but what? Sanfu chuckled. Young master, look, what I have recently. Shen Yu snorted coldly. You want to use these two things to get an advantage from me, right? No, Sanfu rubbed his hands nervously. There is no best, Shen Yu said slowly and calmly. You can report the murder at the inn door and the corpses in the mass graves to the Yaman to see if you can survive. Sanfu was so frightened that he knelt down quickly. How can Sanfu have the courage? Whatever the young master says will be whatever he says. Shen Yu threw her hand, silver light flashed, and Sanfu quickly reached out to catch it. Seeing that it was an ingot of silver, Sanfu blossomed and said with a smile, Don't worry, sir, I have been keeping an eye on it recently. If there is any news, I will report it to you as soon as possible. After leaving the inn, Shen Yu returned to Shen's mansion again. She sneaked in secretly and did not alert Shen Yan, otherwise she might cause trouble if Shen Yan knew she was looking for something. Just as she told Xieting Zhou, it was still the time of Su when she returned to Bailin Palace. She had something to talk to Xieting Zhou. When she arrived at Qingpu residence, Li Jifeng hadn't left yet. The two of them were sitting in the courtyard drinking tea. Come back, Xieting Zhou saw Shen Yu and said, Come and sit. Lanterns were lit in the yard, the moon was rising, and the breeze was blowing. It was a suitable night for moon viewing. Shen Yu sat down, and with Li Jifeng around, it was difficult to talk about many things. Xieting Zhou saw that she had something to say, and inadvertently tipped the cup in her hand and poured it onto her clothes. Xieting Zhou stood up, and Li Jifeng immediately asked, Why are you going? Change your clothes, Xieting Zhou asked. What, you want to wait on me? Li Jifeng hurriedly waved his hand. I declined politely. Although you are unparalleled in appearance, a brother is a brother, and I still have no interest in you. Xieting Zhou smiled and looked at Shen Yu. You come with me. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 123. Naturally, I went back to the bedroom to change clothes. Xieting Zhou entered the room and closed the door. Let's talk. He reached out and unbuttoned his belt. The two of them were undressing in the same room, but they always felt that the atmosphere was a little strange. Shen Yu said uncomfortably, Why do you have to splash it all over me? Xieting Zhou took off his outer robe and said, Li Jifeng loves gossip. If you don't spill it on yourself, how can you avoid him? Shen Yu muttered, There's no need to splash it on yourself. Xieting Zhou paused in throwing away his clothes. How about throwing it on him? He paused for a moment as if thinking, that would be a good idea. Shen Yu smiled. The two of them couldn't stay in the house for too long, so she took the time to say, I searched in my father's study and found nothing suspicious. There were several letters but nothing important was written. This is the result that Xieting had long expected. After hearing the news from Shen Yu yesterday, he had guessed that Shen Zhong'an might have taken sides in the fight for the rightful son, which led to his death. But he didn't say it because he couldn't say it. First, there was no evidence, and second, he couldn't slander her respected father in front of her. But Shen Yu is so smart, she has already thought of this level herself. Xieting casually threw his clothes on the chair. Even if there are important correspondence, they cannot be placed in a place where they can be found at will. They are either hidden deeply or have been destroyed. Shen Yu nodded. It's a pity that I can't search in a big way. There are people coming in and out of the house, and there is too much movement. Maybe it will be more convenient after a while. After hearing this, Shen Yu asked, why? Xieting smiled lightly. It seems that Emperor Tongxue has the idea of granting a marriage to the Shen family. Wouldn't it be easier to find Shen Yan if she gets married? Marriage, Shen Yu asked, with which family? Xieting picked up a clean robe and said, maybe it's the Zhang family, but I'm not sure. We'll know when the imperial edict comes out. Shen Yu frowned slightly and murmured, Zhang family. This was the case in her last life, but in this life she ran away and was replaced by Shen Yan. Xieting lowered his eyes and looked at her face. His eyes moved slightly. Is there a problem? No. Xieting put on his robe and walked up to her. What? Are you unhappy that Shen Yan marries Zhang Lianzi? Shen Yu didn't know how to explain it, so she said honestly, a little bit. Xieting clenched his jaw and turned his face sideways. I dared to bring you back yesterday because I was meddling in my own business. Shen Yu was stunned for a moment. What did you say? Xieting looked back at her. Why are you unhappy? I hold grudges, especially grudges, Shen Yu said angrily. I have been so good to Shen Yan since I was a child, but in the end I really gave it to her. How can I not be angry? Marrying Zhang Lianzi would not be as good as her. What do you mean? Xieting looked relaxed. Then who do you want her to marry? I. Shen Yu never thought about such a problem. Doqing is good. Xieting had a smile on his lips, which made Shen Yu panic. She blinked. Am I too vicious? No. Xieting lowered his head and said, it's just what I want. When the two came out of the bedroom, Li Jifeng was already drunk and lying on the stone table. He was not drunk to death, but he looked back when he heard the voice. Why are you so fast? Shen Yu, is it fast? I'm not saying you're fast. Li Jifeng drunkenly pointed at Xieting. I'm saying he's fast. Shen Yu didn't know why, but she saw Xieting taking a piece of snack and stuffing it into Li Jifeng's mouth. Talk less and eat more. Li Jifeng choked for a moment, took out the snack, held it and looked at it for a while, and said affectionately to Xieting, as expected, he is my brother, and you still love me. After saying that, he took a bite and handed it to Xieting. I love you too. We are half of each other. I wish our friendship will last forever. Don't live this life anymore. Xieting looked at him with disgust and ordered, come here, His Highness Ninth Prince is drunk, take him down to rest. I don't. Li Jifeng clung to the edge of the table and looked up just in time to see Shizhi. He looked at it intently for a moment and suddenly asked Xieting, where is that lovely little waiter you have at Ziwiun Tower? Bring him out and show me. Xieting glanced at Shen Yu and asked Li Jifeng, where did I come from? Just pretend. Li Jifeng leaned on the stone table and started chatting with Shen Yu. Let me tell you, he was not like this before. We used to be in Chu Pavilion, and he even snatched Sister Hua from me. What's Sister Hua's name? Let me think about it. Oh, Yu Qing, doesn't it sound beautiful? Shen Yu nodded and said, yes, it's quite beautiful. Li Jifeng. Xieting warned. If he hadn't drank so much wine, Li Jifeng would have heard it, but he happened to be drunk today. He waved his hand and said, "Don't interrupt, I haven't finished speaking yet." "Let me tell you," Li Jifeng said jealously, "that sister just thinks that his face is better than mine." I revealed my identity and said that I was the prince of the dynasty, but she didn't even look at me. Her eyes looked like long on him. "What happened next?" Shen Yu asked, holding her chin. "Xie Tingzhou, nothing later." "Yes," Li Jifeng said loudly, "of course it's in front of the flowers and under the moon, and the spring night is short. It's you and me." Li Jifeng suddenly grabbed Shen Yu's hand. "Do you think this prince is talented in literature?" Xie Tingzhou couldn't stand it any longer, so he grabbed Li Jifeng by the collar and threw it to the guard. "Help him go down and rest." Li Jifeng struggled hard. I won't leave here." Li Jifeng was dragged away by the guards and cursed. The courtyard fell silent. Xie Tingzhou lowered his eyes and looked at Shen Yu. "Don't listen to his nonsense." Shen Yu nodded. "I heard a lot." "What did you hear?" Shen Yu poured herself a glass of wine. "That's a lot. For example, the prince has 7,749 concubines in Balin, and he is a frequent visitor to the flower houses everywhere." "Do you believe it?" Xie Tingzhou looked at her deeply. "I believe it." Shen Yu took a sip and whispered, "That's what everyone said." Even so, Xie Tingzhou didn't hear a trace of annoyance in her tone. "That Yu Qing, I have never touched it," he said. Shen Yu squeezed her hands tightly. What did he mean by saying this? She didn't ask him if he had touched it. Shen Yu paused, and a thought flashed through her mind. She suddenly raised her head and looked at him. Yu Qing, the title Master Lan Yu, could it be that this is where the title comes from? Xie Tingzhou panicked. Li Jifeng made that up. Shen Yu, it's an illusion. When people mention this title later, it's a beautiful story about flowers in front of flowers and under the moon. It's much more sentimental than stopping the boat to look at the moon, looking at the clear sky at night on the mountain. Xie Tingzhou wanted to explain, but with a thought in his mind, a smile appeared on his lips. "Auntie, you've tasted it? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 124. Ayu. This was the first time that he called her by her nickname. Shen Yu looked at his face intently, as if the strings in her heart were being plucked lightly, and the lingering sound lingered in her ears and could not calm down for a long time. The wine glass in his hand tipped over, spilling onto his hands and then onto his legs. Xie Tingzhou knelt down in front of her, took the wine glass from her hand, and took out a handkerchief to carefully wipe off the wine stains on her hands. Shen Yu's heartbeat quickened, and she let him hold it, drying it carefully one by one. Although her previous life was short, she could be considered a person who had lived two lives, and matters between men and women were no stranger to her. During these days, she didn't feel anything at all. Xie Tingzhou was like a frog boiled in warm water, always showing warmth inadvertently. Before she went to Dali Temple, he had said that he had something to talk about when she came back, but unfortunately things got sidetracked later. In fact, she also deliberately avoided it. She knew very well how difficult it was along the way. The deeper the case was investigated, the more dangerous it became. Now that the prince is implicated in seizing the throne, the future is even more uncertain. They have been bound together for a long time, but now she doesn't want to drag him into the water. Shen Yu subconsciously retracted her hand, but failed this time. Xie Tingzhou's hand held her tightly like an iron vice. He raised his head, the moonlight flowing between his brows and eyes. "Ayu." Shen Yu couldn't hold it anymore and frowned. "Don't call me Ayu." "What's wrong with calling you Ayu?" Xie Tingzhou raised his face and looked at her. "You don't like me calling you that? Then who can call you Ayu?" Zhang Lianzi. Why do you keep mentioning Zhang Lianzi? Shen Yu couldn't see his expression and said with a face, he doesn't deserve it. Xieting Zhou asked patiently, if you don't let me scream, am I not worthy of it? You. Shen Yu turned around suddenly. She didn't know what to say to him. What's wrong with me? Xieting Zhou obviously got into trouble with her. Shen Yu could see a bit of amusement in his eyes, so she tried to pull out her hands again but failed, so she simply struck him with her palms together. Xieting Zhou subconsciously stretched out his hand to block it, but then suddenly let go of his hand and let her palm hit him. This time he finally let go of her and fell backwards. Shen Yu was stunned and hurriedly stepped forward to support him. How are you? Xieting Zhou raised his eyes to steal a glance at her, covered his chest and coughed twice. I'm fine. After saying that, he coughed twice more. Shen Yu knew that her palm was clearly without force, but she didn't know that Xieting Zhou, who used to strike with a sword, was now so fragile that he couldn't even withstand such a palm. You, help me, Xieting Zhou said weakly. Shen Yu helped him up, and Xieting Zhou took advantage of the opportunity to put his arm on her shoulders and lean on her with half of his body. His steps were shaky and his whole body seemed weak. Shen Yu grabbed his arm and put one hand around his waist to get him onto the bed. Xieting Zhou watched her busy, pouring tea and water, twisting the handkerchief and wiping his face. Are you feeling better? Xieting Zhou held the tea, looked at her face steadily, shook his head and said, I'm fine. Do you want to eat something? Shen Yu asked nervously. Xieting Zhou laughed, do you think this is my last meal? Eat something good. Don't talk nonsense, Shen Yu scolded coldly, took the handkerchief and twisted it again. There was a splashing sound, and Shen Yu looked at the messy water waves. What's going on with your body? Poison. Xieting Zhou didn't lie this time. Shen Yu twisted her handkerchief and turned around. Except for Qianling ginseng and blood python branch, are there really no antidotes? How do you know? Don't worry about how I know. No, Xieting Zhou smiled, the other party poisoned me just to kill me, so how could he prepare the antidote? Shen Yu lowered her eyes. It's okay. Xieting Zhou took her hand and said, my life is not in danger for the time being. Seeing that Shen Yu was still unhappy, Xieting Zhou tilted his head slightly and joked, you have been avoiding me, are you afraid that I will shorten my life and make you a widow? Shen Yu glared at him, thank you Ting Zhou. This sound was serious and angry, and Xieting Zhou said warmly, but I can no longer use the sword. I will definitely live to be 100 years old. Shen Yu's expression softened a little. Seeing that it was getting very late, she said to Xieting Zhou, you can rest, I'm going back. I'll see you off. Xieting Zhou was about to get up. No, you rest, De Wang and I will go back by ourselves. Ever since that day when De Wang was caught in a net and Bai Yu fought to save him, perhaps because he was impressed by Bai Yu's power, De Wang became Bai Yu's lackey. Whenever he had time every day, he would come to Qingpu residence to pay homage to his hero. If he were not a male, even people of different races would not be able to stop him, and he would be eager to marry him. Bai Yu despised this younger brother and often ignored De Huang. Xieting Zhou sat back on the bed, listening to the footsteps of a person and a dog gradually disappearing. A gentle smile appeared on his lips. After a while, he lifted the quilt and stood up. He didn't look as weak as before. He opened the window and asked, where is Li Jiafeng? The guard who was keeping watch at night replied, Your Highness, you are not in the side room. You should have gone back to rest. Go back. Where? Xieting Zhou asked. Kono was also stunned for a moment. Xieting Zhou was silent for a moment, picked up his outer robe and went out. Before they reached Lu Mingxian, they heard the sound of Li Jiafeng running and howling, accompanied by a burst of dog barking. Li Jiafeng ran as hard as he could. He ran out of the yard and saw his guard. He pulled out the knife from the guard's waist and was about to chop him. The secret guard suddenly jumped down from the eaves, stretched out his hand to stop him. "No, your majesty, ninth prince." Li Jifeng looked at the secret guard who appeared out of thin air. "Where did you come from?" The secret guard pointed to the eaves. Li Jifeng suddenly exploded. "You didn't come out when my prince was chased by a dog, but you jumped out when he wanted to kill the dog. Isn't this prince worse than a dog?" "It doesn't matter if the secret guard picks up, it doesn't matter if he doesn't." "What's going on?" Xieting Zhou approached and asked. The secret guard said, "His Royal Highness Ninth entered Shizhi's bedroom and was chased by De Wang." Li Jifeng saw Xieting Zhou holding a lantern and quickened his pace and ran to hide behind him. De Wang ran up to him and barked at Xieting Zhou a few times, as if he was complaining. "How dare you complain?" Li Jifeng said, "You were clearly the one who bit me first." De Wang barked twice more. Li Jifeng raised his eyebrows. "Fart. It was your vicious dog who complained first." "Can you understand what it says?" Xieting Zhou said teasingly. Li Jifeng was stunned. "Yes, how could I understand it?" The guard didn't dare to laugh, but the secret guard suddenly jumped up to the eaves and started laughing. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 125. Li Jifeng was originally taken to sleep in a side room by Xieting Zhou's guards, but he felt that the bed was not good for sleeping no matter how hard he slept. After lying there for a while and sobering up, he went to Lu Mingxian where he used to stay overnight. Unexpectedly, De Wang kicked him out when he entered the door. He thought he was a thief and chased him all the way. Xieting Zhou said, "Someone lives in this yard. You can choose a new place." Li Jifeng snorted, "Shizhi, right? You actually gave him the yard where I used to rest. I have long seen that you are a person who values sex over friends." Xieting Zhou turned half sideways. "Then I'll give her another yard tomorrow." Li Jifeng was so moved, "I knew we still have brotherhood." "No." Xieting Zhou looked at him with a smile, "I didn't think you lived here before. It's dirty." "You." Li Jifeng was so angry that he slapped his chest. "Forget it, let's go and pick the yard." After saying that, he shook his sleeves and left with the guards. Xieting Zhou looked away, bent down, and touched De Wang's head. "You did a good job, you protected her for me when I was away." He straightened up and saw Shen Yu standing at the entrance of the courtyard, staring solemnly in the direction Li Jifeng left. "What's wrong?" Xieting Zhou asked. Shen Yu looked away, thought for a moment and then asked, "Can you come in for a moment?" Xieting Zhou walked straight over and entered Lu Mingxian. Shen Yu turned around twice, while Xieting Zhou waited patiently. Shen Yu suddenly stopped and asked, "What kind of person do you know about Li Jifeng?" Xieting Zhou was silent for a moment, then asked instead, "Do you think there is something wrong with him?" Shen Yu said seriously, "I know he is your close friend, and I didn't want to sow discord, but Li Jifeng is right about one thing." "What?" Xieting Zhou said warmly, "He said that I value sex over friends, so if anything happens, just tell me." Shen Yu was now focused on business. "Does Li Jifeng know martial arts?" Xieting Zhou thought for a while. "I don't remember." Shen Yu's expression became more solemn. "He didn't make any sound when he came in, so I thought there was a thief, so I punched something at the door." She held a small pebble between her fingers. She raised her hand and shot the pebble toward a tree. The pebble stuck into the trunk of the tree. Shen Yu walked over and said, "I don't know whether the person coming is fake or not, and I want to stay alive, so I only used 50% of my strength." Xieting Zhou looked at the stone embedded half an inch into the tree trunk. It was so powerful that ordinary people could not avoid it. I didn't hear him scream in pain, but then I didn't find the stone I threw, so he should have caught the stone, Shen Yu said. Xie Zhou stared at the stone thoughtfully. Shen Yu was very skilled in martial arts. He could catch her hidden weapon with his bare hands. His skill should be extraordinary. After a moment, he suddenly said, "Here comes someone." The secret guard appeared from the darkness, and Shen Yu understood Xie Zhou's intention in an instant. She shot a stone towards the secret guard with 50% of her strength. The secret guard raised his hand to take it, walked over and spread it out in front of Xie Zhou. Xie Zhou raised the lantern and took a closer look. There was a stone lying on the palm of his hand. There was a faint red mark on the palm, which was caused by the stone hitting it. "No offense intended," Shen Yu asked, "how is this brother's kung fu?" The secret guard said seriously, "It's slightly inferior to Zai Feng." Shen Yu nodded and said, "Since he can catch hidden weapons with his bare hands, the strength of his kung fu can be seen from the color of his hands. If there are no marks on his hands, then his kung fu is probably not inferior to 11 Feng. It's not scary to have kung fu. What's scary is that if Li Jiafeng is really good at martial arts, how deep a person's scheming must be to be able to pretend to be a piece of mud that can't hold up the wall in front of others without being discovered. This is the scary thing." Xie Zhou's eyebrows darkened. "You should rest first." Shen Yu suddenly pulled his sleeve. "Are you going to find him? What if he—" "Don't worry," Xie Zhou patted her hand, "I'll take someone there." Shen Yu felt relieved and said, "Then you must be careful. Li Jiafeng's new yard is not far from Xie Zhou's Qingpu residence." Xie Zhou went without anyone, carrying a wine bottle in one hand and going alone. Before he even entered the door, he heard Li Jiafeng's ghostly cry and howling. "Hiss gently, gentle, it hurts, it hurts." Xie Zhou paused for a moment, opened the door and stepped into the room. Li Jiafeng, half undressed, was quite surprised to see Xie Zhou coming. "Why are you here?" Xie Zhou raised the wine bottle in his hand and said, "I can't sleep, so I came to you for a drink." "No problem," Li Jiafeng said, "Brother, I never say no to things like drinking wine and going to flower houses, but you have to wait a while." After that, he called the waiter over and said, "Keep going." The waiter put medicinal wine on his hands and rubbed a bruise on Li Jiafeng's shoulder. Xie Zhou's eyes moved slightly. "How did you do it?" Li Jiafeng grimaced in pain. "What else can you do? I just don't know who lives in that house." "Be gentle, Shijir is too cruel, just give me a slap when you enter the door, here dash." Li Jiafeng threw a pebble on the table. "That's it?" Xie Zhou picked up the stone and looked at it, pretending not to ask, "She hit you with this?" "Yes," Li Jiafeng said aggrievedly, "I know you value sex over friends. If you hadn't protected him, do you believe I would have rewarded him with 30 pieces of gold?" Xie Zhou calmly looked at the injury on Li Jiafeng's shoulder. The injury spread in a circle, with the outer circle turning blue and the inner circle turning purple. Li Jiafeng waved his hand to ask the waiter to step aside, and straightened his clothes casually. "Oh, I'm not talking about you." Li Jiafeng changed the topic. "How can you stand such a fierce person? The sister of Ziwiun Tower is not as delicate and soft as the sister of Ziwiun Tower. Also, walking on land is not as smooth as walking on water." Xie Zhou was too lazy to listen to his nonsense and poured him a glass of wine. Li Jiafeng put his right hand on his leg and took it with his left hand. "What's wrong with your hand?" Xie Zhou asked. Li Jiafeng said, "Don't you know how good your own guarding skills are? You beat me to the point where I can't even lift my hands." "Let me take a look." Xie Zhou held his hand. "No, no, no," Li Jiafeng waved his hand. Xie Zhou grabbed his hand, held his shoulder with one hand and squeezed it twice. His eyes pretended to glance across Li Jiafeng's palm casually, and he let go and said, "It's okay, no bones were hurt." He picked up the wine glass and clinked it with Li Jiafeng. "I'll apologize to you on her behalf." How could Li Jifeng take Xiao? He chuckled twice and said, it's pointless to just verbally apologize, then Yu Cheng. It's been several years, Xie Tingzhou said, I still miss Yu Cheng. Li Jifeng said, you always miss things you haven't tasted, don't you? I can't even invite the Warren to come, so you have to come forward. You don't even give the ninth prince face. The melons that are forced are not sweet. Okay, Xie Tingzhou nodded and said, I'll find someone for you another day. Li Jifeng had drunk a lot before, so he had sobered up a bit after the scene, but now after 2 bottles of wine, he was drunk again. Li Jifeng was lying on the table, still yelling, don't, hiccup, forget what you promised me, that Yu Qing, hiccup. Xie Tingzhou was also slightly drunk. 11 Feng came to pick him up and help Xie Tingzhou away. The chamberlain stepped through the door and whispered, Master, His Royal Highness is gone. Li Jifeng opened his eyes, and the darkness in his eyes flashed away. He sat up slowly, I haven't had enough to drink, hiccup. How can I, hiccup, leave? Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 126. The chamberlain lowered his head and said, Master, it seems that he has begun to doubt. Isn't it? Li Jifeng tilted his body carelessly, he is Xie Tingzhou. But Li Jifeng said to himself, he actually put the guard in Lu Mingxian. I thought he was just doing it for outsiders to see. Is it possible that he is really good at this? The chamberlain stood aside quietly, what should we do now? Li Jifeng suddenly said, there is nothing we can do. The soldiers will come and cover up the water and earth. As long as they don't harm me, it will be fine. The corridor was very long. After turning the corner, Xie Tingzhou, who was still drunk just now, straightened up. He didn't look half drunk and unconscious. Shen Yu hadn't slept. She was worried that something would happen if Xie Tingzhou and Li Jifeng broke up, and she was worried that she was too sensitive. Xie Tingzhou entered the courtyard, and Shen Yu immediately stepped forward. How about it? Xie Tingzhou said, go in and talk. Xie Tingzhou was not completely drunk. His drinking capacity was good or bad. After a bottle of wine, his mind was still clear, but his face and eyes were stained with a bit of drunkenness. He leaned his head on the table. Shen Yu quickly poured him a cup of tea, then turned around and ordered, "Lv Yao, make a bowl of hangover soup." After she closed the door, Xie Tingzhou raised his eyelids and looked at her. Li Jifeng has a wound on his right shoulder, which is comparable to Shi Zi. I checked his hand and there is no scar on it. Shen Yu asked in surprise, did I hit him on the shoulder? Xie Tingzhou frowned and thought for a while, are you sure you didn't hear him shout? Shen Yu recalled it seriously, and her eyes suddenly lit up. I remembered, he didn't scream at that time, I thought he was hiding, but after a while he screamed again, about a breath later, I thought it was Dawang bite him. She lowered her eyes and said, if that's the case, maybe I'm worrying too much. I don't think anyone is normal now, and I'm just like a snake. There weren't many people that Xie Tingzhou could really call friends. She also made him doubt his best friend, which made him feel a little bit sorry. Xie Tingzhou said calmly, don't blame yourself, being vigilant is a good thing. He didn't know what he thought of, and his eyes deepened, how about brothers, let alone others? The ones who are most likely to stab others are often the ones closest to them. Everyone in this world must be on guard. Shen Yu heard something profound, you mean? Just saying it casually. Shen Yu nodded and said solemnly, I'll try him again when I get a chance. No need to go. Xie Tingzhou put his fingertips between his eyebrows, closed his eyes and frowned. He drank a little too much today, and the wind blew when he came, and now he felt a little dizzy. If Li Jifeng has a problem, after tonight, he will definitely be wary of you. You won't be able to test it out. I'll replace him with someone else. Okay. Shen Yu sat down and asked, are you feeling uncomfortable? Xieting Zhou opened his eyes and looked at her. He had a good nature. When he was slightly drunk, his eyes were clouded and looked particularly beguiling. Auntie. Shen Yu interrupted him and changed the subject. If Li Jifeng is really pretending, how deep does he have to be? Xieting Zhou's eyes were calm. It's too blunt. What? Shen Yu didn't know why. The question is too blunt. Just calling me Au will make you so nervous. Shen Yu was exposed on the spot, but she didn't feel ashamed. Instead, she said, then you still screamed after knowing it. There was a hint of anger in this reproach, which made Xieting Zhou feel comfortable all over. Shen Yu said again, you haven't said it yet. If Li Jifeng is really pretending, what is his purpose? Xieting Zhou was speechless. He had never seen someone as incomprehensible as Shen Yu. All he could think about was revenge, besides investigating the case. It's actually very simple, Xieting Zhou explained patiently. He was born as a prince. Standing in that position, one step away from the throne, who wouldn't want to take a chance, if he is really pretending? Xieting Zhou paused. All I want is the supreme position. Just as Shen Yu was about to speak, Lu Yao knocked on the door. Sir, the hangover soup is ready. Shen Yu went to open the door, brought soup, and said to LV Yao, you go to bed first, nothing will happen tonight. The hangover soup was still a little hot. Shen Yu slowly stirred it with a spoon to dissipate the heat. She could feel Xieting Zhou's eyes on her, so deep and heavy. Shen Yu simply met his burning gaze and put the bowl in front of him. Drink. Xieting Zhou picked it up, put aside the spoon and drank slowly. When the bowl reached the bottom, he leaned his head on the table. Shen Yu wondered, what you drank was hangover soup, not wine, so why did you faint? Xieting Zhou half raised his eyelids. Have you ever drank hangover soup? No. Shen Yu shook her head. Xieting Zhou said, it's just a hangover soup, not a panacea that will instantly make you live full of energy. Shen Yu curled her lips and said, okay. There was a dim lamp in the room, and neither of them spoke. It was very quiet. There are too many things in Shen Yu's mind. Even if Li Jifeng has problems, he still wants the throne. This is not inconsistent with her current goal, so she can put it aside for now. Now there are two things that need to be resolved first. One is the old man from Kikane Mansion, and the other is who Emperor Tongxiu will send to lead the troops to suppress the bandits in Kikane. I am afraid she will have to go to Kikane Mansion in person. Thinking of this, several more questions popped up in Shen Yu's mind. She stopped talking and looked quietly at Xieting Zhou's face reflected in the lamp. There was no blemish on his face, his sleeping face was quiet and calm, and his breathing was steady and gentle. Shen Yu knew what kind of eyes he had hidden under his eyelashes. When he first saw her, there was a cold and murderous look in his eyes, but gradually, when he looked at her, there was only clarity and tenderness left. Everything was so perfect, but it was a pity that it appeared at the wrong time. Shen Yu sighed and opened the door. Lu Yao dozed off leaning on the threshold, and Shen Yu shook her awake. Didn't I tell you to go to bed? Where is 11 Feng? Lu Yao sat up sleepily, rubbed his eyes and said, Zifeng asked me to tell you that he went back to rest first, and I have been waiting to tell you. Get up. Shen Yu raised her arm. What will happen to the one inside if he leaves? Lu Yao took a look and said, Zifeng also said that you are also a guard, so I asked you to make your own arrangements. He really knows how to take some time off from his busy schedule. Shen Yu muttered, patted the green medicine. Okay, go to bed. Lu Yao yawned and left, and Shen Yu walked to the courtyard. Is there anyone there? No one responded except for the rustling of leaves in the night wind. She looked at the eaves and trees a few more times. Is the secret guard here? After waiting for a long time, no one showed up. Shen Yu sighed. It seemed that everyone was quite lazy and no one was seen at the critical moment. She walked back to the room and patted Xie-Ting-jo, who was lying on the table. "Wake up and I'll take you back." "Thank you, Ting-jo." Xie-Ting-jo finally opened his eyes. His eyes were blank and filled with sleepy red bloodshot eyes. He looked at her intently for a moment, held her hand, and closed his eyes again. "You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 127. After putting Xie-Ting-jo on the bed, Shen Yu lowered her head to look at the person on the bed. He was sleeping deeply and had lowered his guard. "You take my bed," Shen Yu said. Another voice in my heart said, "You also took his bed a few days ago." She said dissatisfiedly, "You mess with my heart. But who is not in trouble? Didn't he spread himself out for her to see?" Shen Yu looked at him, feeling agitated in her heart, and finally sighed heavily, "Who is afraid of whom? It's not like I haven't slept at all." After saying that, he lifted the quilt and got into bed, pushing Xie-Ting-jo in. She waved her sleeves, the lights in the room went out, and the moonlight sneaked in through the cracks in the window. The room was very quiet, and the place under the quilt where he had slept was very warm. Shen Yu's breathing gradually became calmer in the darkness. In the darkness, Xie-Ting-jo slowly opened his eyes, turned sideways, and smoothed her slightly messy hair with his fingers. His eyes fell on her face and never moved away. Xie-Ting-jo woke up at dawn the next day. Hangovers tend to give you headaches, and you can't sleep when you wake up, but he didn't get up because there was someone hanging on him, with his thighs draped over him and his hands on his waist. He couldn't remember when he fell asleep last night. Xie-Ting-jo turned to look at her. She was sleeping soundly, her chin pressed tightly against his body, causing her mouth to pout slightly. Xie-Ting-jo curled his lips slightly, raised his hand and suddenly wanted to poke her. I don't know how long she had been lying there, but Shen Yu showed no signs of waking up. Xie-Ting-jo suddenly turned his head and looked out the window with unclear meaning. He gently moved her hands and feet away, sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, and then stood up to open the door. As soon as the door opened, Lu Yao was stunned. This description made it look like the two of them slept together last night. Xie-Ting-jo had a large cloak casually draped over his shoulders. Underneath was a spotless white lining, but it was a pity that it was wrinkled from sleep. He turned around and walked in. Chang Lu, who was holding a tray, immediately followed him in. The tray was placed on the table for Xie-Ting-jo to change. Chang Liu whispered, "The concierge at the east gate came to report that a waiter named Sixi came to see Shijie early in the morning, saying that there was something urgent." Xie-Ting-jo asked, "Where are the people?" Chang Liu said, "We didn't dare to make a noise and let him stay in the concierge." The two of them spoke very softly, for fear of disturbing the people in the room. Xie-Ting-jo glanced into the inner room, tied his belt and went in. Chang Liu walked slowly on purpose and pricked up his ears to hear Xie-Ting-jo shouting "Aou" in a low voice from inside. "What time is it?" Shen Yu asked lazily. "It's almost time." "Why is it so late?" "Well, don't sleep, get up and have breakfast." It was the first time Chang Liu heard Xie-Ting-jo speak in such a gentle voice. When he stepped out of the room, something stirred in his mind. The voice inside didn't seem to be Shijie's. Why did it sound like a woman? Unfortunately, he was distracted before he could think about it carefully, and the green medicine at the door caught him. "The prince, he slept with our young master." Chang Liu was used to it. "Yeah, it's not the first time." Lu Yao's face was full of shock, and he murmured after a long while, "The young master is so awesome, I will finally make her get what she wants." Chang Liu heard some clues, thought for a moment, and asked, "You mean, Shijir has been plotting against our highness for a long time?" Lu Yao quickly waved his hand, "No, no." Xie Tingzhou, who was studying abroad, narrowed his eyes, "No." Lu Yao took 2 steps back, and after thinking about it, it was not impossible to say, so he said, "My young master once said that the person she admired was Mr. Lan Yu, and he said it to Mr. Zhang." Chang Liu looked solemn and heard Xie Tingzhou say from inside the room, "Go and bring that waiter in." Si-11 came here early in the morning. San Fu stayed vigil at the inn last night. When she came back early this morning, she told him what happened. The young master had told him before that he had something urgent to look for Shijir at the east gate of the palace, so he hurried over. The palace was heavily guarded, and there were several posts at each step. Si-11 had never seen such a big battle. The most luxurious residence he had ever entered in his life was the residence of Lu Yuan's wife. Sixi was brought in by the guards. She knelt on the ground without daring to raise her head. She could only smell the faint fragrance of food in the room. Shen Yu said, "Get up and talk." OK. Sixi stood up and secretly raised his eyes. There were 2 people sitting at the table. He lowered his eyes without daring to take a closer look. "My brother stayed vigil at the inn last night. He came back in the morning and said that something happened at the inn last night." Shen Yu didn't ask, waiting for Si-11 to continue. Sixi said, "There was a fire in the inn last night, and the fire was in the room where things were stored in the inn. Fortunately, it was discovered in time and it didn't start. Only a few things were burned." Before Shen Yu could grasp the key point of his matter, Si-11 had already taken off the baggage from his shoulders and spread it on the ground. Si-11 continued, "Some people said that they saw a figure, and it was someone who deliberately set fire to it, but why did the room burn down? First someone went to look for the baggage, and then it caught fire. I wondered if someone was looking for something but couldn't find it. He came back to set the fire on purpose." Seeing Shen Yu nodding in agreement, Si-11 felt happy. From that night when he went to the mass grave, he could see that the young master was not an ordinary person. If he wanted to work with the young master for a long time, he had to let the young master find that he was a useful person. Everyone can snoop for information, but not everyone has a smart mind. So this morning I asked Sanfu to steal those people's baggage to see if I could find any clues. Shen Yu said, "You did a good job." She glanced at Lu Yao, who understood and stepped forward to reward him. Shen Yu looked through those bundles last time and didn't find anything special. However, as Sixi said, someone deliberately set fire to it, which means that what they were looking for was not found. It was either in the bundle or there. On the old man. Shen Yu was just about to get up to check the baggage, but was pulled back by Xie Tingzhou. "Use the food first, the things are right there, there's no rush." Shen Yu sat down to eat again and asked, "Is there anything else?" Yes. Si-11 hesitated, "But Shen Yu, it's nothing, just tell me." "Ah, okay." Sixi said, "That's right, there is something strange happening outside the city. It was reported from the vegetable farmers at Keishikao this morning. The Kapok village outside the city is closest to the mass graves. Everyone smelled it last night. There was a strange smell, and I saw flames shooting into the sky over the mass grave." The more Si-11 spoke, the more excited she became. "Some brave people ran to see this morning. The corpses in the mass graves were burned. They were doused with kerosene. There were several kerosene barrels on the roadside. Last night, the villagers, the smell is that of burning corpses." Shen Yu slowly put down her chopsticks. Si-11 was confused. "Taste." "Get out," Xie Tingzhou suddenly said coldly. Si-11 didn't know what she said was wrong, which offended the 2 masters. She was so frightened that she quickly kowtowed and said, "Young master, please spare my life." Shen Yu turned to look at Xie Tingzhou. He looked at Si-11 with a sullen look on his face, indicating that a storm was about to come. Okay, Shen Yu said, you go down first. They had all smelled the smell of burning corpses in Yanliang Pass, and after hearing what Si-11 said, the smell of rotten and burnt smell seemed to have not dissipated. Shen Yu picked up the chopsticks again, but didn't move them for a long time. Xie Zhou took the things in her hands and asked the maid to come in and clean them up. If you can't eat it, don't eat it. I'll have someone prepare some snacks for you later. What do you want to eat? Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 128. I don't have much appetite for the moment. Chen Yu walked over and looked at the bundle on the ground. She had checked this baggage last time and found nothing unusual, but the other party obviously cared about a certain thing, so she checked it again and again, and even thought of setting it on fire when she couldn't find it. Shen Yu pinched the fabric and took out a dagger to pick apart the threads. The winter coat was very thick, but when she tore it open, there was nothing inside. Green medicine. Shen Yu turned her head and shouted, balling up the bundle and throwing it out, tear them all apart for me and look carefully. Lu Yao caught it, put it on the ground and started tearing off his clothes. Chang Liu looked amused and stepped forward to help. Shen Yu said to Xie Zhou, after so many days, the body has already rotted. Why should they burn it again? Xie Zhou pondered for a moment, shook his head and said, I haven't figured this out yet. Shen Yu was about to speak when she suddenly heard the green medicine in the courtyard yell, Rhubarb, don't bite. Looking back, I saw De Wang running into the yard with a legging in his mouth. Lu Yao had just arrived at the palace not long ago, and he was not familiar with De Wang. De Wang didn't listen at all, and one of them chased behind and the other ran in front. De Wang. Shen Yu shouted loudly. De Wang ran over with his leggings in his mouth. Shen Yu took the leggings from its mouth. The cloth outside the leggings had torn, exposing the iron inside. Unfortunately, after tearing it apart, nothing was found except the hammered iron. So lively. Shen Yu looked back and saw Li Jifeng walking into the yard and looking down when he passed Lu Yao and Chang Lu. What are you doing, tearing your clothes to play with? Shen Yu pursed her lips, but before she could think of a reply, Xie Zhou came out of the room. Have you not suffered enough from last night? Come here again. Li Jifeng rubbed his shoulders with lingering fear. Boy, that was so cruel. My prince is still in pain. He glanced at Xie Zhou and said to Shen Yu, you give me a rub, and I will let you go. Xie Zhou snorted coldly, would you like me to rub it for you? It's just a joke, Li Jifeng said with a smile, I knew you couldn't bear it. What's the matter with coming so early? Xie Zhou got straight to the point. Oh, Li Jifeng remembered now, there is a banquet in the palace tonight, and you and I will go together. Xie Zhou glanced at him, I'm grounded now. Li Jifeng said, those are all false. You know my father, he wants face and is most afraid of being criticized. Although you are banned, the palace held a banquet and your grand prince, Balin, was actually banned from home, and he pointed out no matter what others say, they will definitely say that he is afraid of Balin targeting you, and he will not let such a thing happen. The maids and guards in the courtyard all lowered their heads. If Li Jifeng wasn't a prince, these words would be truly disrespectful. In fact, everyone tacitly understood what Li Jifeng said, but no one would say it so straightforwardly. It looked like he was talking without thinking. Li Jifeng seemed not to notice, and raised his hand to throw something to Xie Zhou, I'll tell you if it came from the palace, my father must let you go. Li Jifeng left after not staying for a while. Xie Zhou took the invitation and patted it in his palm a few times, then turned his head and asked, do you think I want to go? Shen Yu took the post and looked at it. It was Zhang Changping's post, and threw the question back to him, do you want to go? Xie Zhou smiled lightly and said, go, Since Emperor Tongxue is so afraid of being criticized, of course I have to help him and give him face. Maybe there will be some good shows. What's the show? She was shorter than Xie Tingzhou, and her eyes were so wide when she looked up at him that people couldn't help but want to scratch off her nose. I'll tell you when I get back. Emperor Tongxue was the best at superficiality. Last year, something as big as Yan Liangwen happened. The banquet of hundreds of officials in the palace on the 8th day of the 12th lunar month was also cancelled. The palace banquet on New Year's Eve was also simplified. The euphemistic name was to save money to support the families of deceased soldiers, which won Emperor Tongxue some favors. Good reputation. This was the first banquet held in the palace in the 18th year of Tongxue. Huanglu Temple cheered up, but he couldn't be extravagant, and he had to save face for the emperor. Emperor Tongxue sat at the top, with the queen and concubines on his left and right, followed by the princes, and civil and military officials. Behind Xie Tingzhou was the entire Balin, so the seat was naturally not low. After sitting down, Li Jifeng squeezed his way to his side, but Emperor Tongxue scolded him back, saying that he didn't look like a prince at all. Guanglu Temple passed the meal and officially opened the banquet. It was rare for the palace to be so lively, and everyone was very happy. The Queen Mother was old and in poor health, so she sat hastily for a while and then left. Emperor Tongxue sighed, finally, another year has passed. This cup is dedicated to my 100,000 soldiers of the great Zhou dynasty. Prince Li Jinjing immediately held up his hands and said, "Father, please don't be upset. Father is aware of everything and can find out the traitors. This can be considered as a way for all the soldiers to rest in peace." Li Jifeng rolled his eyes, whispered flattery under his breath, and winked at Xie Tingzhou. Emperor Tongxue nodded and said, "Speaking of which, I must have contributed a lot to keeping Yan Liang Pass and stopping the boat." Xie Tingzhou held the wine and said, "Your Majesty has given rewards to my ministers. I feel very comfortable in directing my affairs. Can you feel uncomfortable whispering in the palace? I haven't been there a few times since taking office, and I haven't been to court a few times." Emperor Tongxue smiled and said, "Tingzhou is now 22. It's coming soon." Xie Tingzhou said, "Your Majesty, please be concerned. I already had an heir at the age of 21, and you are not married yet. Isn't King Balin in a hurry?" "I'm anxious." Xie Tingzhou smiled, "Isn't it that I haven't found the right one yet? Your Majesty wants to grant me a marriage." "This kid," Emperor Tongxue pointed with a smile, "do you have someone you like?" Zhang Lianzi stared at Xie Tingzhou intently. When he saw Xie Tingzhou turning his head to look at him, his look was very deliberate and a bit provocative. "Xie Tingzhou, that's not true." Zhang Lianzi's fists were loosened, and a sneer appeared in his heart. "Nothing more." Then I heard Xie Tingzhou say, "But I heard that Master Shuwen, the Minister of War, and Taifuyu's daughter are both talented and beautiful. I don't have to choose, either one or two will do. If your Majesty grants me a marriage, I will be overjoyed." Win. This sounds like he wants to enjoy the blessings of everyone. Who doesn't know that Xie Tingzhou was in trouble the day before yesterday because of a waiter from Chuguan? What a nonsense, a low shout sounded in the hall. Emperor Tongxue's face froze for a moment, then he smiled again and said, "Your marriage will naturally be decided by King Balin. I can't stretch my hand too long." Xie Tingzhou sighed, "That's such a pity." He drank a glass of wine and looked across at Zhang Lianzi. Everything was as he expected. How could Emperor Tongxue grant him a marriage? If his family status was high, Emperor Tongxue would be afraid of giving him a chance to gain popularity. If his family status was low, he would be afraid of being accused of treating Balin harshly. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 129. Emperor Tongxue followed his gaze and looked at Zhang Lianzi, Zhang Iking is not married yet. Zhang Lianzi shook the wine glass in his hand, stood up and said, Your Majesty. Emperor Tongxue interrupted, I heard that you are in love with the daughter of the Shen family and have come to propose marriage. Is this true? Yes, Wei Chen once invited my mother to come to ask for marriage. Emperor Tongxue nodded slightly, what a pity, Shen Iking is no longer here. Everyone present felt sorry. Emperor Tongxue changed his subject, who else is there in the Shen family now? The Chamberlain Defo on the side quickly answered, Mrs. Shen is currently ill, and General Shen has a daughter at his knees. Zhang Lianzi's heart skipped a beat when he heard Emperor Tongxue say, the Shen family sacrificed their lives for the country, and we cannot let our loyal ministers feel cold. Since Zhang Iking is in love with the Shen family's daughter, then I will serve you and Shen today in front of all the civil and military officials. The second daughter of the family is given a marriage, and she chooses an auspicious day to get married. Zhang Lianzi's heart sank as he met Xie Tingzhu's teasing gaze. Obviously Xie Tingzhou had known for a long time that there would be such an episode today, but he himself was still kept in the dark. This is a great joy. Defo pinched his voice and said, Your Excellency, please accept the order to express your gratitude. Zhang Lianzi cupped his hands and said, I'm afraid there is some misunderstanding here. The person I like is actually Shen Yu, the eldest daughter of the Shen family. There was an uproar in the palace. Isn't Miss Shen dead? Even Emperor Su was stunned for a moment and looked sideways at Defo. Defo's neck was sweating, but that was not the case according to rumors. What was wrong? Emperor Tongxue couldn't come down for a while. The eldest daughter of Shen's Hongan has died in Yanliang Pass. She has passed away. My beloved, you should look forward to the future. Since you are fond of the Shen eldest daughter, now only the second daughter is left in the Shen family. With you, it's also fate. Zhang Lianzi gritted his teeth, walked to the palace, lifted his robes, knelt down, and said, Your Majesty, I don't want to. Hold it, Zhang Yuanqing warned. Zhang Lianzi glanced at Xie Tingzhou. Xie Tingzhou met his gaze, and an ominous premonition came over him. Zhang Lianzi raised his head and looked at Emperor Tongxue, I have a crush on Miss Shen and would not marry her. I am willing to marry Miss Shen on the memorial tablet of Shen Yu. I promise to take the position of my wife and never marry again in my life. Snapped. Zhang Yuanqing slammed the table, asshole. The sound of Xie Tingzhou crushing the cup was lost in the sound of slapping the table. His eyes swept across the crowd and landed on Zhang Lianzi, his cheeks moving faintly. Everyone's eyes were focused on Zhang Lianzi, except for one person, who was looking at Xie Tingzhou thoughtfully. Zhang Yuanqing had been ill since the last time the prince knelt down and asked for leave, so he took a few days off. Today he felt a little better before coming to the banquet. At this moment, he was very angry with him. Someone on the side advised him, Sir, please calm down. Minister Zhang is a man who values affection and righteousness. Zhang Yuanqing's eyes were locked on Zhang Lianzi. Marrying someone with a memorial tablet is called a ghost marriage among the people. It is rare among the people. He dared to talk about such an unflattering thing at a palace banquet. Zhang Lianzi lowered his eyes in the eyes of everyone, but had no intention of compromising. Emperor Tongxue was held back by him and couldn't get off the stage. He was full of anger but couldn't get angry easily. Bang bang bang. The officials followed the sound and saw Xie Tingzhou lazily propping up his legs, stroking his palms and smiling. Tisk, tisk, Minister Jiang's affection is really touching, but... Xie Tingzhou turned to look at Emperor Tongxue, Your Majesty, I heard that Mr. Jiang came to ask for marriage but was rejected. Everyone has heard this rumor, and there was a lot of excitement in Beijing at that time. Emperor Tongxue's eyes moved slightly. Someone handed him the steps and asked him to come down first. I've heard a little bit about it. Xie Tingzhou said, then Miss Shen refused the marriage first and died in the battle. Now Master Zhang is forcing the marriage. Does it mean that Miss Shen cannot refuse the marriage again? I'm afraid Master Jiang's doing this is a bit. Everyone in the palace knew that Xie Zhou and Zhang Lianzi had conflicts for a long time. They took the opportunity to break out and described the marriage proposal as a forced marriage. The matter became serious immediately. Miss Shen is also a poor person. Xie Zhou sighed. It would be better for Minister Zhang to first ask Miss Shen if she is willing to marry, otherwise it would be bad to rob her by force. No one is here, how can I ask? Isn't this a joke? At this time, the sixth prince Li Zhaonian stood up and said, Father, Miss Shen has gone. I don't think the Lord Assistant will be able to ask about the result. I will give up on the marriage as soon as I see it. That's all. Emperor Tongxue waved his hand. Nowadays, every young man has more ideas than the last, and I am not willing to be that old and dim emperor. The officials shouted Your Majesty again, and the palace banquet started again. The banquet ended a little early. Emperor Tongxue left the banquet first due to his poor health, and the officials also left one after another. Li Jifeng stayed until the end and called the waiter to help Xie Zhou to rest. He walked to Xie Zhou's table and squatted down. The cleaning lady knelt down and said, Your Majesty, ninth prince. There were several broken cups on the cupboard, which were piled in the corner under the table. Li Jifeng picked up a piece and looked at it. There was a little blood on the corner. It seemed that what he saw at that time was correct. Xie Zhou had indeed crushed a cup. Although it was indeed unbelievable that Zhang Ji wanted to marry someone with a memorial tablet, it would not make Xie Zhou lose his temper like this. One is Zhang Ji, the other is Xie Zhou, and there is a dead person Shen Yu who has never met but is involved in it. What's the problem here? Li Jifeng suddenly stood up and walked out. Xie Zhou was still in the palace, so he went to take a look before talking. After leaving the door, a small yellow door hurriedly ran towards me. Your Majesty, ninth prince, you ordered your servants to send the crown prince to rest, but His Royal Highness insisted on going back to the palace and has already been picked up by the guards. It seems he is not drunk, Li Jifeng murmured. Xie Zhou was really drunk. There were many people who came to toast tonight, so he accepted them all. He drank even more than last night. The carriage stopped, and 11 Feng and Kuang Wei helped him get out of the car. Your Highness, slow down. Be careful. Xie Zhou half leaned on Zifeng and walked a few steps in a messy manner. He inadvertently raised his eyes and saw the person standing at the door of the palace. Shen Yu hadn't slept, worried that he would fall seriously ill when he came back from the palace banquet like last time. 11 Feng was about to carry him in, but was caressed away by his hand. Xie Zhou smiled towards the door. Auntie. He broke away from Kono and staggered towards her drunkenly. Seeing that his steps were unsteady, Shen Yu took a few steps forward and reached out to help him, but he fell over and buried his head in the crook of her neck. The smell of alcohol was very strong, and it seemed that he was really drunk, otherwise he would not have put all his weight on her. Fortunately, Shen Yu practiced martial arts, and ordinary women would have been overwhelmed by him. Shen Yu hugged his waist and bore his weight. The turbid smell of alcohol spraying around her neck made her tilt her head and look at Zifeng. Why did you drink like this? 11 Feng said, I'm not waiting nearby, so I don't know, but His Highness only drinks like this when he is in a bad mood. Shen Yu frowned and heard Xie Zhou call Au again against her neck. Xie Zhou was really annoying when she was drunk. No one wanted her to support her. Shen Yu half dragged and half hugged him to Qingpu residence, and he lay on her body calling her nickname one after another. Shen Yu was upset by his shouting and cursed coldly, shut up. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 130. 11 Feng and a group of guards looked at their noses and hearts, pretending not to hear. His Highness didn't say anything, so what could they say? When the drunk Xieting Zhou was brought back to Qingpu residence, Shen Yu even broke into a thin sweat on the spring day. The maids are in good order, making tea and preparing water. The water is ready in the bathroom, so I'll leave it to the guards. After saying this, the maid withdrew. Shen Yu looked at Xieting Zhou, who was drunk on the bed, and felt her head grow heavy. She pushed the person on the couch, but she wasn't too drunk. Xieting Zhou slowly opened his eyes, his scattered gaze fell on her face, and it took a long time to focus. "Auntie, do you want to take a bath?" Shen Yu asked. "Bath," Xieting Zhou murmured, and just as he stood up, he fell down again. Shen Yu held his back and said, "You're so drunk, so don't take a shower today." His slightly drunken eyes stayed on her face for a long time, and then he said, "Okay, I'll do whatever you want." After being drunk, Xieting Zhou looked completely different from his usual self. The inherent nobility and oppression in his body disappeared, replaced by a softness that could touch the heartstrings. Shen Yu leaned over and covered him with the quilt. When she stood up, the back of her neck suddenly tightened. Someone grabbed the back of her neck and stubbornly refused to let her go. Their eyes were no more than a slap apart. Xieting Zhou locked her eyes tightly and gently stroked her cheek with the back of his fingers, causing a subtle shiver. Shen Yu clenched her hands and was defeated by those loving eyes. Shen Yu just looked at him like this, leaning on him, as if she was about to kiss him in the next second. He was drunk. She told herself this, so he probably wouldn't remember it tomorrow. The force behind her neck became stronger, dragging her body downward. Once the defensive line that has been painstakingly forged collapses, it will no longer be able to withstand the power of those arms. The distance was getting closer and closer, the tips of their noses were already touching each other, and she even held her breath. Shen Yu's eyelashes trembled twice, she closed her eyes forcefully as if resigned to her fate, and then carefully touched his eyebrows with her fingers. It was at this moment that the world turned upside down. Xieting Zhou suddenly turned over and pressed on her, veins popped out on the back of his hands on both sides, and the scarlet color in his eyes gradually began to spread. "I'm drunk," he said. With a double entendre, he was drunk on her lowered defenses, then leaned forward and kissed her. Perhaps because he was drunk, there was no restraint in this kiss, and it became a wanton request once touched. The kiss was hot and intense, blocking her lips and taking away her breath. Xieting Zhou relaxed himself and leaned down. She clearly had no way to retreat, but he still held the back of her head with his hand, not allowing her to dodge, and plundered her lips and tongue wantonly, burning straight into her heart like a ball of fire. So hot, this kiss. The spring night seemed to be on fire. The strong alcohol released what was pressed in her body. Xieting Zhou clamped her chin. The taste was not enough. It seemed that he had to bite her, tear her apart, and stuff it into his body to be satisfied. He restrained himself, put his thumb on her chin to tilt her head, and sucked hard on her neck. Shen Yu's mind suddenly went blank, and her grasping hands pulled out the hills one by one from the quilt. Xieting Zhou opened her fingers and forcibly inserted his fingers. The candles burned out in the scorching spring night, and everything was silent. Shen Yu had his arm around her waist, lying on the bed with her eyes open, staring at the dark top of the bed in a daze. After all, he didn't do anything more extreme. He came back to his senses a little before the defeat and fell asleep with her in his arms. She kept her eyes open like this until dawn. When the morning light fell faintly on the window, Shen Yu stood up. Xieting Zhou's hands moved, and when he grabbed the soft quilt, the slight unhappiness that had just gathered on his brows dissipated, and his breathing became calm again. Shen Yu stopped in front of the bed, and when she heard the sound of Bai Yu walking under the eaves, she turned around and walked out of the room. She almost didn't sleep all night, and fell asleep when she returned to Lu Mingxian. She didn't know how long she had slept, but Shen Yu was woken up by a knock on the door. Opening the door, Lu Yao ran in nervously, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. Lu Yao said nervously, "Is this what the young master was looking for yesterday?" Shen Yu took it and found that a piece of paper was missing and there were marks on it that had been chewed by dogs. "Where did it come from?" Lu Yao threw a leggings on the table. "I went to feed rhubarb this morning and found it in its nest." Shen Yu quickly scanned the contents of the half page and then went to check the leggings. The cloth at both ends of the leggings has been chewed to pieces, and the iron inside is exposed. The middle is hollow, and there are gnawed lines on the surface. Shen Yu came closer, scratched it with her nails, twirled her fingers, and said, "That's it. The person who made this thing is a smart man. The leggings are hollow to hide things, and then the outer layer is sealed with iron powder mixed with wax oil. It can't be seen at all from the appearance. If it hadn't been for the rhubarb to grind its teeth and play with it, I wouldn't have discovered it." There were 2 pieces of paper in the gap. Shen Yu took them out and read them again, then asked Lv Yao, "Have you read the contents on them?" Lu Yao shook his head. "I rushed to find you when I saw it, but I didn't have time to look." Shen Yu nodded heavily. "Don't tell anyone about the discovery of this thing." "Including His Highness the Crown Prince?" Lu Yao asked subconsciously. Shen Yu was stunned for a moment, and the beautiful scenery of last night came into her mind again. She was silent for a long time, and then said, "No, it is not included. I will tell him myself." Lu Yao nodded in understanding, and heard Arya shouting His Royal Highness from outside. Shen Yu quickly folded the paper and hid it, looked left and right, and threw the hollowed leggings under the bed. After doing this, Xieting Zhou just stepped into the room. "Get out!" he stared at Shen Yu, but said to Lu Yao. Lu Yao exited and gave Shen Yu a thumbs up as he closed the door. Shen Yu glared at her, and when she looked away, she met Xieting Zhou's cold eyes. "Can I help you?" "Xieting Zhou, I was drunk last night." Shen Yu felt that these words sounded like the excuses made by the heartless man who did not want to take responsibility after eating and wiping them clean, but the meaning when applied to Xieting Zhou was different. Shen Yu looked at him unclearly. Xieting Zhou's side face was enveloped in the soft light coming from the clear tiles. That face was really well made, with smooth and beautiful outlines, sharp yet soft, nothing more or less. Xieting Zhou stared at her and took a few steps forward. "I'm drunk, so I don't remember some things so clearly." "This is what Shen Yu expected." She smiled and said, "Since you forget it, it's God's will. Whatever you want it to do." Xieting Zhou seemed not to have heard it and said to himself, "But I don't want to pass by in a daze, so I want to verify it again." "What do you want to prove?" Xieting Zhou had already held her face and kissed her. "Last night was a half-hearted act after being drunk, today is a sober act." Shen Yu was stunned, and until Xieting Zhou stepped away and looked down at her, she was still in a state of shock. Xieting Zhou wiped his thumb across her wet lips and answered her question. "Ask if it's as good as last night, and the answer is, it's even better. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi." Chapter 131. Xieting Zhou focused on her eyebrows. "I just taught you a few days ago, how could you forget? Don't let anyone bully you, not even me. If I wake up and really forget, you can just let it go. Am I being bullied like this? If you forget, forget about it." Shen Yu pretended to be lukewarm and said, "Walking around the world, how big of a deal is this? Is it worth it for you to talk about it?" Xieting Zhou's eyebrows flashed with hesitation, but he quickly suppressed him. "Then are you going to just pat your butt and forget it?" He raised the ends of his eyes and said, "How heartless." It was obvious that he was contemptuous of her last night, but now he seemed to have been wronged. Don't complain first. Shen Yu raised her chin and said. Xieting Zhou smiled, what should I do? You have to be responsible for me. Shen Yu said angrily, you. Okay. Xieting Zhou comforted her warmly, brushed the red mark on her neck with his thumb, and suddenly said seriously. I don't care about 3 matchmakers and 6 betrothals. The person I meet will be mine. Sooner or later, I will marry him. There is no difference between him and me. I didn't continue last night because. Xieting Zhou paused, his eyes hot and forbearing, it's because I'm drunk, I'm afraid I can't remember clearly, ew. The tender flesh on Shen Yu's heart felt sore and soft as if someone had pinched it hard. Now she was so drunk that she seemed to be herself. Hug him. Kiss him. A voice said to her. She moved her fingers little by little, grabbed his wrist, and gradually calmed down under his solemn gaze. I can't do it yet. I know. Xieting Zhou answered her. Shen Yu's mind wandered. It may take some time. When I finish what I am doing now, are you willing to wait for me? Xieting Zhou's eyebrows widened and he said, well, I'll wait for you. Yes. Shen Yu nodded vigorously. It was always easy for people to feel at a loss in front of the person they liked. Shen Yu felt that she didn't look like herself anymore. She looked at him helplessly and spoke intermittently, it won't take too long. If it really takes too long, then you. Just what? Xieting Zhou asked with a smile, what if I can't wait? Let me marry someone else. Shen Yu raised her neck and said, would you like to marry one? I will go to watch the ceremony then. Then the designation won't work. Xieting Zhou joked. If you go, I will definitely go with you, don't worry. Xieting Zhou stroked her hair and said, I will always wait for you. Until Xieting Zhou left, pink bubbles seemed to be rising in the room. Once you make up your mind, you won't be in the same dilemma as before. Shen Yu calmed down, closed the door, and spread out the previous papers on the table one by one. There are 3 in total, 1 is a letter, and the other 2 should be torn from a certain account book, with serrations on one side. She could understand the letter clearly. It should be a letter written by a certain official in the DPRK to the family of a ghost who was a bandit in Kikang. It was signed without a name and it was already 3 years ago. The letter asked the other party to pay attention to the fact that it will rain in the past few days. If it rains heavily, be sure to bring an umbrella to avoid getting hurt by the rain. Shen Yu read the remaining letter several times. It looked like a letter written to relatives and friends. There is something unusual about the ledger, and the way it is recorded is different from usual. There must be a problem, but Shen Yu couldn't figure it out for a while. If she could find the old man, she might be able to get the answer. Shen Yu opened the door and said, green medicine. Lu Yao jumped over and said, sir. Shen Yu ordered, go to shopkeeper Lu and see if there is any letter from Hes Hu. By the way, ask how you are doing with the things I want. After hearing this, green medicine ran away. Come back. Shen Yu said, I haven't finished yet. Let him inform each shop and pay more attention to that person's movements. Which person? Lu Yao was stunned for a moment, then suddenly realized, oh, I understand. Shen Yu closed the door and snapped her fingers at De Wang. De Wang ran over with his tail wagging like a sledgehammer. Master, are you going to Qingpu residence? Lv Yao asked when he saw that she was about to go out. Shen Yu turned around and glanced at her. There's a problem. No problem, no problem. Lu Yao waved his hand cheerfully, but His Royal Highness just left in the morning, and you are chasing after him at noon. Don't you understand what it means to be reserved? I think you're right. Shen Yu stopped, waved her hand and said, come here. Lu Yao walked over with a smile, Mr. Father, what kind of father? Shen Yu grabbed her ears. If you dare to make fun of me, believe it or not, I will rip off your ears. Lu Yao covered his ears. In fact, it didn't hurt at all. I was wrong, Wrong. Shen Yu let go of her and snorted softly, "De Wang, let's go to Kingpu residence." De Wang likes to play with Bai recently. When he heard that he was going to Kingpu, he ran very fast all the way. Shen Yu was one step behind. When she arrived at Kingpu residence, De Wang was barking at the yard. The two guards at the door looked intently. Just as Shen Yu was standing still at the door, the closed courtyard door opened and Zai Feng came out. 11 Feng said, "His Royal Highness is resting. He has not fully recovered from his hangover last night. You can come over later." Okay, Shen Yu thought for a moment. When she saw him in the morning, he was quite sober. "Let's go, De Wang," Shen Yu shouted to De Wang. Not far away, Uncle Zhong chased after her. Wait, wait. Shen Yu turned around and saw Uncle Zhong walking slowly, so she turned back and said, "Uncle Zhong." "Hey." Uncle Zhong responded and said, "His Royal Highness is not in the mansion. It has been too long since he took Kang hunting. The little beast couldn't stay any longer. When he came back in the morning, he took Kang and Bai Yu into the mountains." "Shen Yu, but isn't he grounded?" Uncle Zhong smiled, "That's why Zai Feng told you that he was resting. Punishment and grounding are just an attitude. There is no one to guard him. As long as he doesn't go too far, it will be fine." "That's good." After Shen Yu finished speaking, she saw Uncle Zhong looking at her up and down, with a smile in his eyes and a loving look on his face, which made her feel very uncomfortable. Zhongbo smacked his lips happily. "I sent a letter to Balin Prince's mansion a few days ago to tell the old prince about this great happy event. I thought that the prince would receive the letter in a few days. Balin Prince's mansion has not sent a letter for a long time. It's a happy occasion." Shen Yu smiled awkwardly. "Well, since His Highness is not here, I will go back first." Uncle Zhong said with a smile, "Go, go." Shen Yu turned back the way she came, thinking that Uncle Zhong was really impatient. A few days ago, she and Xieting Zhou hadn't even figured out the horoscope, but Uncle Zhong had already written the letter. But it's a coincidence that when King Balin receives the letter, he should. Wrong. A thought suddenly flashed through Shen Yu's mind. There was something wrong with that previous letter.